Turn left, I said, my voice so calm it surprised even me, and in that exact moment, I realized that if I hadn't spoken up, my entire life would have quietly slipped out of my hands without a single raised voice or a single warning sign. The road ahead stretched long and familiar, lined with tall maple trees just beginning to turn gold in the early fall light, the kind of peaceful suburban drive I had taken hundreds of times over the years to attend family dinners, birthdays, and holidays that were supposed to bring us closer together. Yet that morning, something felt wrong in a way I couldn't immediately explain, something subtle but sharp, like a splinter just beneath the surface. Robert's hands tightened on the steering wheel for half a second before he forced a small smile, the kind he used when he thought I wasn't paying attention, and said, "Why?" "The GPS says to keep going straight." I turned my head slowly, watching the way his eyes flickered between the road and the screen, avoiding me, and that was when it settled in my chest, heavy and cold. The GPS had never been necessary for a drive to our son's house. We had been there just 2 Sundays ago. "Turn left," I repeated, a little softer this time, not because I doubted myself, but because I was giving him one last chance to tell me the truth. He hesitated, just for a breath, before flicking on the signal and turning onto a quieter street, one that led away from the main road and into a neighborhood I didn't recognize. The silence that followed wasn't loud, but it was thick, filled with all the things either of us was saying. I stared out the window, watching unfamiliar houses pass by, each one neat and polished, their lawns trimmed to perfection, their windows reflecting a life that looked stable from the outside. It reminded me of something Emily once said, her voice light but her words precise, about how appearances were everything, about how people only respected what they could see. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now, I wondered how many things I had chosen not to see. 6 months ago, everything had still felt normal, or at least what I believed normal to be. Sunday dinners, polite conversations, small laughs over coffee, the quiet comfort of routine. I had trusted that what we had built as a family was solid, something that didn't need to be questioned. But trust has a way of softening your vision, of smoothing over the edges of things that don't quite fit until they disappear completely. A missed phone call here, a vague answer there, a decision made without asking me first. None of it seemed important on its own. Not until you placed them all side by side and saw the pattern forming. Robert cleared his throat, as if searching for something safe to say. "Emily mentioned they wanted to try a new place today," he said, his tone casual, almost rehearsed. I nodded slowly, letting the words hang in the air without responding, because I knew that wasn't true. Emily didn't suggest new places without making a point of explaining them in detail, of presenting them as if they were her idea of something better, something improved. And she had said nothing to me. Not a message, not a call, not even a passing comment the last time we spoke. My fingers rested lightly in my lap, steady, composed, even as my thoughts moved faster than they had in years, connecting pieces I hadn't realized I'd been collecting. The unopened envelope on the kitchen counter last week. The way Daniel had changed the subject when I asked about it. The brief look Robert had given him, a silent exchange I hadn't understood at the time. I understood it now. We drove another mile in silence before I saw it, a low, modern building set back from the road, its sign clean and understated, the kind of place designed to look welcoming without revealing too much at first glance. Robert slowed the car slightly, his grip tightening again, and I felt something inside me shift, not panic, not fear, but clarity. A quiet, undeniable certainty that whatever waited for me inside that building had already been decided without me, planned carefully, politely, and completely. I leaned back against the seat, my expression calm, my voice even when I finally spoke again. "You can pull over here," I said, pointing toward a small side street just before we reached the entrance. Robert glanced at me, confusion flickering across his face, but he didn't argue this time. He turned the wheel, guiding the car away from the path they had chosen for me, and as the building disappeared from view in the rearview mirror, I realized something else just as clearly. They thought I didn't know. And that was their first mistake. I did not ask where we were going next because I already knew the answer would not matter, not anymore, and the quiet hum of the engine filled the space between us as Robert kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, as if by concentrating hard enough he could avoid the conversation that had been building for weeks, maybe months, right under my nose. I folded my hands together, resting them gently in my lap, noticing how steady they were, how different this felt from the version of myself I used to be, the one who would have asked questions immediately, who would have searched for reassurance in his voice, who would have wanted to believe whatever explanation he offered, no matter how thin it sounded. "You missed a turn," I said after a while, not accusing, not emotional, just stating a fact the way one might comment on the weather. He exhaled slowly, a controlled breath, then nodded. "I know," he replied, his voice low, almost careful. "I figured we could take a different route." A different route. The words lingered in my mind, simple and harmless on the surface, but carrying a weight they were never meant to hold. That was what this had been all along, I realized, not one big decision, not one obvious betrayal, but a series of small adjustments, subtle changes in direction that gradually led me away from everything I thought I understood. It had started so quietly that I could not even pinpoint the exact moment. Maybe it was the day Daniel stopped calling just to check in, replacing those easy conversations with short, efficient updates that felt more like obligations than genuine care. Or the afternoon Emily suggested we consolidate certain financial documents. For convenience. Her tone warm and persuasive, her smile perfectly timed. At the time, it had sounded reasonable. Helpful even. I had agreed without hesitation, grateful that someone was taking an interest in keeping things organized. Now, sitting in the passenger seat as unfamiliar streets passed by, I saw those moments differently, not as isolated events, but as pieces of something larger, something deliberate. Robert adjusted his grip on the steering wheel again, his fingers tapping lightly against it, a habit he had when he was thinking too much. "Emily put a lot of effort into today," he added, as if offering reassurance, as if saying her name would somehow smooth over the tension that had settled between us. I turned slightly, studying his profile, the lines around his eyes, the way his jaw tightened just enough to betray what he was trying to hide. "I am sure she did," I said, and I meant it. Emily had always been very good at putting effort into things that mattered to her. Presentation, timing, perception. She understood how to shape a situation so that it appeared thoughtful, even generous, while quietly serving a different purpose underneath. I had admired that about her once. I had mistaken it for care. The car slowed as we approached a stop sign, and for a brief moment, everything felt suspended, like we were caught between two choices that could not exist at the same time. Go forward, or turn away. Accept what was being offered, or step outside of it completely. Robert glanced at me then, finally meeting my eyes, and I saw something there that made my chest tighten, not anger, not cruelty, but uncertainty, the kind that comes from following a plan that no longer feels entirely right. "It is just a conversation," he said, as if trying to convince both of us. I gave a small nod, my expression unchanged, because I understood now that it was never just a conversation. Conversations do not require secrecy. They do not need carefully chosen locations or unexplained changes in direction. They do not involve documents that appear without warning or decisions made in quiet rooms where one voice is noticeably absent. As he pressed the accelerator and the car moved forward again, I leaned back slightly, letting the seat support me, my thoughts settling into something clear and focused. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to confront him here, in the middle of a street lined with strangers' homes and neatly trimmed hedges. There would be time for that, if it was even necessary at all. Because the truth was, whatever they had prepared, whatever they believed I would agree to without question, it no longer held the same power it once might have. I had seen enough to understand the direction they intended to take me, and more importantly, I had already begun to choose a different one for myself. By the time we pulled into a quiet parking lot 2 blocks away from that building, the kind of place where no one paid attention to who came and went, I already knew that whatever had been arranged for me was meant to happen today, at that exact time, with everyone in place and every detail prepared so carefully that I would have no reason to question it, no space to hesitate. And certainly no opportunity to refuse without looking unreasonable, and that realization did not frighten me the way it might have before. Instead, it settled over me like a layer of clarity I had been missing for far too long. Robert turned off the engine but did not move right away, his hands resting on the steering wheel as if he had forgotten what to do next, and I watched him quietly, noticing how different he looked when he was not trying to perform calm, how the tension in his shoulders told a story his words had not yet revealed. "We should not be late," he said finally, though there was no urgency in his voice, only a kind of obligation, like he was repeating something that had already been decided for him. I tilted my head slightly, studying him with a patience that came from understanding more than he realized. "Late for what, exactly?" I asked, not pressing, just allowing the question to exist between us. He hesitated again, and that hesitation was louder than any answer he could have given. "It is just a meeting," he said, choosing each word carefully, as if precision might make it true. "A meeting." I let the word settle in my mind, turning it over the way I used to examine small details when something felt out of place, and suddenly I could see it all with startling sharpness, not just today, but the pattern that had been forming for months behind polite smiles and carefully chosen conversations. I remembered the afternoon Emily had insisted on coming over unannounced, bringing coffee and pastries, sitting at my kitchen table with that same composed expression she always wore when she was about to introduce an idea she had already decided was best for everyone. She had spoken about long-term planning, about simplifying responsibilities, about making sure everything was secure for the future. And I had listened, nodding, appreciating what I believed was concern, never once questioning why every suggestion seemed to involve moving something out of my hands and into someone else's control. Daniel had sat quietly that day, his eyes fixed on his cup, offering only brief comments when prompted, and Robert had agreed with just enough enthusiasm to make it seem natural, as if they were all working together for my benefit. At the time, it had felt like support. Now, sitting in a parked car with the engine cooling around us, it felt like preparation. I opened the glove compartment slowly, as if searching for something ordinary, and my fingers brushed against a folded piece of paper I had noticed earlier that week but had not yet unfolded, choosing instead to wait until the right moment presented itself, and as I pulled it out now, smoothing it gently across my lap, I did not need to read every word to understand its purpose. The headings were enough. Authorization. Transfer. Consent. Language that sounded official, helpful, even protective on the surface, but carried a finality beneath it that left very little room for interpretation. I felt Robert's eyes shift toward me, his breath catching just slightly as he realized what I was holding, and in that small reaction, I saw everything I needed to see, not just his involvement, but his awareness, his understanding of what today was meant to accomplish. "You were going to have me sign this," I said quietly, not accusing, not raising my voice, just stating the truth as it revealed itself piece by piece. He opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again, and that silence confirmed more than any explanation could have. I folded the paper carefully, placing it back exactly where I had found it, not because I intended to ignore it, but because I no longer needed it to prove anything to myself. The situation was clear now, every detail aligned in a way that left no room for doubt. I rested my hands in my lap again, my posture relaxed, my expression calm, and when I looked at him, there was no anger in my eyes, only a steady awareness that could not be undone. "Let us take a moment," I said softly, as if suggesting something simple, something reasonable, even kind, and as he nodded slowly, uncertain but compliant, I understood something with absolute certainty. They believed this day would end with my agreement, with my signature, with my quiet acceptance of a decision that had already been made for me. What they did not understand, what they had never taken the time to consider, was that I had already stepped outside of that plan the moment I asked him to turn left, and everything that came next would no longer follow the path they had so carefully prepared. We sat there longer than necessary, the quiet stretching just enough to become uncomfortable, and yet neither of us rushed to fill it, because something had shifted in a way that made small talk feel almost dishonest, as if pretending everything was normal would only make the truth more obvious. I turned slightly in my seat, looking out at the empty parking lot where a few scattered cars sat under the soft afternoon light, their shadows long and still, and for a moment, I allowed myself to step back from the present, to trace the path that had led us here with a clarity I had not possessed before. It was not sudden, I realized. Nothing about this had been sudden. It had been built slowly, carefully, layer by layer, in ways so subtle that they blended seamlessly into everyday life. I thought about the house, the one Robert and I had lived in for over 30 years, every corner carrying a memory, every room shaped by time and routine, and how, over the past 6 months, small things had begun to change without ever being directly addressed. The spare bedroom had been reorganized by Emily during one of her visits, boxes moved, closets adjusted, as if she were preparing the space for a purpose she had not yet explained. Daniel had started referring to the house differently, not as your place, or Mom and Dad's home, but simply as the property, a word that felt detached, almost transactional, as though the emotional weight of it had already been removed in his mind. At first I had dismissed these details, telling myself I was reading too much into harmless behavior, that families evolved, that roles shifted over time. But now, with the pieces laid out in front of me, I could see how each small change had served a larger intention, one that did not include my voice in any meaningful way. Robert shifted beside me, finally turning his body slightly toward mine, his expression careful, measured, as if he were trying to find the right approach without knowing where to begin. "They are just trying to help," he said quietly, and there was something in his tone that almost sounded like hope, like he wanted that to be true as much as he wanted me to believe it. I met his gaze not with anger, but with a steady calm that surprised even me. "Help me with what?" I asked, and the simplicity of the question seemed to unsettle him more than any accusation could have. He looked away again, his eyes returning to the windshield as if the answer might be written somewhere beyond it. "Things are getting more complicated," he said after a moment. "Managing everything, keeping up with the house, the finances, it is not as easy as it used to be." I listened carefully, not because his words were new, but because they were familiar in a way that revealed how often they had likely been repeated without me present, how many conversations had taken place in rooms I had not been invited into. "So the solution is to take it out of my hands," I said, still calm, still measured, and this time, he did not respond immediately. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full of acknowledgement, of things understood but not openly admitted. I nodded slightly, more to myself than to him, because I finally saw the structure of it all, not as a chaotic series of decisions, but as a carefully guided process that led to a single outcome, one where I would be positioned as someone who needed assistance, someone who should be relieved of responsibility for her own life. I could almost hear Emily's voice in the background of it all, composed and persuasive, framing each step as reasonable, as necessary, as beneficial. It was not forceful. It did not need to be. It was consistent, patient, and precise. I rested my hands together again, feeling a quiet steadiness settle deeper within me, not resistance, not defiance, but something stronger, something rooted in understanding rather than reaction. "You agreed to this," I said softly, and this time it was not a question. Robert's shoulders lowered just slightly, the weight of that truth landing in a way he could not avoid. "I thought it would make things easier," he replied, and there it was, the justification, simple and familiar, the kind people use when they have already crossed a line they cannot easily step back from. I let out a slow breath, not out of frustration, but out of recognition, because I understood now that this was never about ease, not for me, at least. It was about control, about reshaping my role without ever asking if I was willing to accept it. And as I sat there in that quiet parking lot, with the afternoon light beginning to shift and the world continuing on around us as if nothing had changed, I realized that the most important decision had already been made, not by them, but by me, in the moment I chose to see everything clearly instead of accepting what was being presented. Whatever they had planned next, whatever conversation they expected to unfold inside that building, it no longer held the same weight it once might have, because I was no longer walking into it unaware, and that difference, quiet as it was, changed everything. It was strange how quickly everything became quiet once the truth settled into place, not the kind of silence that feels empty, but the kind that carries weight, that sharpens every detail around you until even the smallest movement feels intentional. And as I sat there beside Robert, I realized that for the first time in a long while, I was not reacting, I was observing. I reached for my handbag slowly, deliberately, not because I needed anything from it right away, but because I wanted to feel something familiar in my hands, something that belonged entirely to me, and as my fingers brushed against the worn leather, I found a sense of grounding that had been missing in all those recent conversations where decisions seemed to happen around me instead of with me. Robert glanced at me again, his expression uncertain, as if he was waiting for me to say something definitive, something that would either confirm his expectations or challenge them, but I offered him neither, only a calm presence that made it impossible for him to predict what I might do next. "We can still go," he said after a moment, his voice softer now, almost tentative, and I understood what he meant, not just physically, but in a broader sense, as if he was asking whether I would step back into the version of events that had already been prepared for me. I gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the choice itself. "Yes," I said quietly, "we can." And that was the truth. I could walk into that building, sit at that table, listen to their carefully constructed explanations, and even play the role they expected me to play, because understanding something does not always require immediate opposition, sometimes it requires patience. As we stepped out of the car, the air felt cooler than before, a light breeze moving through the trees at the edge of the lot, and I took a slow breath, allowing myself one final moment of stillness before everything that had been arranged began to unfold. The walk toward the building was not long, perhaps 50 yards at most, but each step felt measured, purposeful, as if I were moving through a space that had already been set for a performance I now intended to watch rather than participate in. Through the glass doors, I could already see them, Daniel standing slightly off to the side, his posture stiff, his hands tucked into his pockets in a way that reminded me of when he was younger and unsure of himself, and Emily seated at a small table with a folder neatly placed in front of her, her back straight, her expression composed, every detail exactly as I would have expected. When she saw us approach, she smiled, that same warm, controlled smile that had convinced me so many times before that everything was being done with the best intentions. "There you are," she said as we stepped inside, her tone light, welcoming, as if nothing about this moment was unusual, as if this were simply another family gathering, another opportunity to sit together and talk. I returned the smile, matching her calm, not because I believed it, but because I understood its purpose. Daniel looked at me then, really looked, and for a brief second, something flickered in his eyes, something that felt like hesitation, or perhaps recognition, but it passed quickly, replaced by the same quiet compliance I had seen growing in him over the past months. "Mom," he said, his voice careful, "we just want to go over a few things with you." I nodded, taking my seat without resistance, my movements unhurried, my posture relaxed, as if I had all the time in the world, and in that moment, I realized that this was where they believed everything would fall into place, where their planning would meet its conclusion, where I would sign, agree, and accept the role they had quietly prepared for me. Emily opened the folder, sliding a set of papers toward me with practiced ease, her eyes watching my face for any sign of reaction, any indication that her carefully structured approach was working exactly as intended. I glanced down at the documents, then back up at her, my expression unchanged, my voice steady when I finally spoke. "Go ahead," I said softly, giving her the floor she had been preparing for, because sometimes the most powerful position is not the one where you speak first, but the one where you allow everything to be revealed before deciding how to respond. Emily began speaking in the same measured tone she always used when she wanted something to sound reasonable, her voice calm, her words carefully chosen, each sentence placed like a piece in a structure she had already built long before I ever walked into that room, and I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed, but because I wanted to hear how far she was willing to go. How clearly she would reveal the shape of the plan when she believed I was still unaware of it. "We have been thinking a lot about what is best moving forward," she said, her hands resting lightly on the table, her posture composed, professional in a way that felt almost out of place in a family setting, and I noticed how she occasionally glanced at Daniel, as if expecting silent confirmation, while he nodded just enough to show alignment without fully stepping into the conversation. "It is really about making things easier for you," she continued, offering that same word again, easier, as if repetition could soften its meaning, as if it could disguise the fact that ease for one person often required surrender from another. I lowered my eyes briefly to the papers in front of me, not reading every line, but recognizing enough to understand their intent, the formal language outlining transfers, permissions, restructuring, all framed in a way that suggested care, but carried an unmistakable shift in control. "This way, you would not have to worry about managing everything on your own," she added, her smile gentle, reassuring, practiced, and I almost admired the consistency of it, the way she never allowed even a hint of pressure to surface in her delivery. Daniel leaned forward slightly then, his voice quieter, more hesitant, as if he were trying to contribute without fully owning the conversation. "It is just to help Mom," he said, and I heard the echo of Robert's earlier words in his tone, the same justification, the same belief that intention alone could define the outcome. I lifted my gaze, meeting his eyes, and for a moment I saw the boy he used to be, the one who would look to me for guidance, for reassurance, and I wondered when that shifted, when his certainty began to come from somewhere else. "Of course," I said softly, not challenging him, not dismissing him, simply acknowledging what he believed to be true. Emily slid a pen across the table then, placing it neatly beside the top document, her movements smooth, deliberate, the final step in a process she had clearly rehearsed in her mind more than once. "There is no rush," she said, though the placement of the pen suggested otherwise, a quiet contradiction that might have gone unnoticed if I had not been paying such careful attention. I let my hand rest near the paper but did not reach for the pen, allowing a small pause to settle into the space between us, just enough to shift the rhythm of the moment, just enough to remind them that this was not proceeding exactly as expected. "I appreciate the effort you have all put into this," I said, my voice even, my expression calm, and I meant it in a way they would not fully understand, because effort, even when misplaced, still revealed intention. Emily's smile held, but I saw the slightest tightening at the corners, a subtle change that told me she was beginning to sense something was different, something she had not accounted for. "We just want to make sure everything is secure," she replied, reinforcing the narrative she had constructed, and I nodded slowly, as if considering her words, as if weighing them carefully against everything I had come to understand. "Security is important," I agreed, my tone thoughtful, measured, and I allowed another brief silence to follow, not long enough to create discomfort, but long enough to create awareness. Then, without changing my expression, without raising my voice, I added, "Which is why I made a few decisions of my own recently." The shift was immediate, not dramatic, but unmistakable, like a subtle change in temperature that everyone in the room could feel without fully recognizing it at first. Daniel straightened slightly, his attention sharpening, while Emily's gaze fixed on me with a new level of focus, her composure still intact, but now attentive in a different way, as if recalculating, as if adjusting to information she had not anticipated. Robert remained quiet beside me, his stillness speaking more than any words he might have offered, and I could sense his awareness growing, his understanding beginning to align with mine. I rested my hands lightly on the table, my posture unchanged, my voice steady as I continued, not revealing everything, not yet, but allowing just enough to shift the balance of the conversation. "I thought it would be wise," I said calmly, "to make sure that anything important was reviewed independently, just to avoid any misunderstandings." Emily's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the folder, a small, controlled movement that might have been missed by anyone not watching closely, and in that moment, I knew that whatever came next would no longer unfold according to the plan they had so carefully arranged, because the one thing they had not prepared for was the possibility that I had already stepped ahead of them, quietly, without announcement. and with complete clarity. The room did not change, the table remained the same, the light from the window still fell softly across the surface, and yet something fundamental had shifted, something that none of them could fully control anymore, and I could see it in the way Emily held her posture just a little tighter, in the way Daniel's eyes moved between us more quickly now, searching for direction that was no longer being clearly given. "Reviewed independently?" Emily repeated, her tone still composed, but now carrying a sharper edge of attention, as if she was trying to measure exactly how much I knew and how much I was choosing not to say. I gave a small nod, keeping my movements slow and deliberate, allowing the calm to remain intact. "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "It seemed like the responsible thing to do." I did not rush to fill the silence that followed, because silence, I had learned, often encouraged people to reveal more than they intended. Emily's fingers tapped lightly once against the folder before becoming still again, and I noticed how she straightened a sheet of paper that did not need adjusting, a small gesture that betrayed the shift beneath her carefully maintained control. "Of course," she said after a moment, her smile returning, though it felt slightly more structured now, less effortless. "That makes sense. We just wanted to help you avoid unnecessary complications." I held her gaze, not challenging, not agreeing, simply present, and for a brief second, I saw something flicker there, not uncertainty exactly, but recalculation, as if she was already adjusting the next step in her approach. Daniel cleared his throat quietly, leaning forward again, his hands now resting on the table instead of tucked away, as if he felt the need to participate more directly. "Mom, we just thought it would be easier if everything was handled in one place," he said, and I could hear the sincerity in his voice, but also the influence, the echo of conversations that had shaped his understanding without him fully examining them. I turned my attention to him, softening my expression just slightly, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted him to see that I was not his opponent in this moment. "Easier for who?" I asked gently, and the question settled between us in a way that did not demand an answer, but made the absence of one more noticeable. He hesitated, his gaze dropping briefly to the papers before lifting again, and in that hesitation, I saw the first real crack, not in the plan itself, but in the confidence behind it. Robert shifted beside me, his chair making a faint sound against the floor, and I sensed his awareness deepening, his earlier uncertainty now turning into something closer to recognition. I reached for my handbag again, not hurried, not dramatic, simply continuing a motion that felt natural, and when I opened it, I did not look down immediately, allowing the moment to stretch just enough to draw their attention without forcing it. "I spoke with someone last week," I said, my tone conversational, as if sharing a minor detail rather than introducing something significant, and that was when Emily's focus sharpened completely, her attention no longer divided, no longer casual. "Someone?" she asked, and this time, the question carried more weight than before. I nodded once, finally glancing down as I retrieved a neatly folded document, placing it on the table with the same care she had used earlier when presenting hers. "An attorney," I said simply, letting the word settle without elaboration, because it did not need explanation. The effect was immediate, though subtle, like a quiet shift in air pressure that everyone could feel but no one acknowledged out loud. Daniel leaned back slightly, his expression tightening as he processed the implication, while Emily's smile held, but only just, the edges now carefully maintained rather than natural. "I wanted to make sure I fully understood my options," I continued, my voice even, my posture unchanged, "before making any decisions." Robert exhaled slowly beside me, a breath that sounded almost like relief, and I did not look at him, but I felt the shift in him as clearly as I had felt the shift in the room. Emily's hand moved toward the pen again, then stopped, her fingers resting lightly against it without picking it up, and for the first time since we had entered, she did not immediately respond. That silence told me everything I needed to know. They had prepared for agreement, for hesitation perhaps, even for mild resistance, but not for this, not for a step taken outside their awareness, not for a decision made without their influence. I folded my hands gently on the table, my gaze steady, my presence calm, and as I looked at each of them in turn, I understood that the balance had shifted in a way that could not easily be reversed, not because I had raised my voice or challenged them directly, but because I had simply chosen to see clearly, to act quietly, and to arrive at this moment already prepared for whatever they thought they had arranged. Emily recovered first, not by speaking immediately, but by adjusting her posture, straightening slightly as if reclaiming control through composure alone, and when she finally did respond, her voice was just as smooth as before, though now every word carried a more deliberate weight, as if she were stepping carefully across ground that was no longer entirely stable. "That is perfectly fine," she said, her tone warm, accommodating, and yet there was a subtle tension beneath it, something measured, something calculating. "We always encourage you to review anything important." I nodded, acknowledging her statement without reinforcing it, because I understood that this was her way of reframing the situation, of pulling it back into a structure where she could still guide the outcome. Daniel shifted in his chair, his fingers interlacing briefly before separating again, a small, restless movement that spoke louder than any words he might have offered, and I could see that he was no longer entirely certain where he stood in this conversation, no longer sure which direction it was moving or who was leading it. I reached forward then, not for her papers, but for mine, unfolding the document I had brought with me and placing it carefully beside theirs, aligning the edges as if both sets of pages belonged to the same discussion, though we all understood they represented very different intentions. "My attorney suggested a few updates," I said calmly, my voice steady, almost conversational, as if we were discussing something routine rather than something that was quietly dismantling the foundation they had built. Emily's eyes moved to the document, scanning quickly, efficiently, her expression composed, but I noticed how her gaze lingered just a fraction longer on certain lines, how her fingers pressed slightly into the table as she read. "Updates?" she repeated, her tone still even, but now edged with a question she had not needed before. "Yes," I replied simply, allowing the word to settle without elaboration, because the details would speak for themselves. Daniel leaned forward again, his attention fully drawn now, his earlier hesitation replaced by a focused concern as he glanced between the two sets of papers, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had expected. "What kind of updates?" he asked, and this time, his voice carried a sincerity that felt less rehearsed, less influenced, as if he were finally engaging with the situation as it was rather than as it had been presented to him. I looked at him gently, not with confrontation, but with a quiet clarity that did not require emphasis. "The kind that ensure I remain responsible for my own decisions," I said, my tone calm, but unmistakably firm, and I watched as that statement settled into the room, changing its shape in a way that could not be undone. Emily's smile did not disappear, but it tightened again, becoming more precise, more controlled, as if she were holding it in place rather than allowing it to form naturally. "Of course," she said, though this time the words sounded less like agreement and more like an adjustment, a recalibration of strategy. "We just want to make sure everything is handled properly." I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the sentiment without yielding to it, because I understood now that language like that could be shaped to support almost any outcome, depending on who was defining what properly meant. Robert remained quiet beside me, but I could feel his presence differently now, not as someone passively moving through the situation, but as someone beginning to see it from a new angle, his earlier uncertainty shifting into something more grounded, more aware. I allowed a small pause to settle, not to create discomfort, but to give the moment space to fully form, to let each of them sit with the reality that had emerged without rushing to cover it with more words. Then, gently, without changing my tone, I added, "There is also one more thing." And this time, I let my gaze rest on Emily just a second longer than before, not as a challenge, but as a quiet signal that what followed would matter. Her attention sharpened instantly, her posture still composed, but now entirely focused, every part of her engaged in a way that revealed how carefully she had been managing each step until now. "Go ahead," she said, and for the first time since we had sat down, there was a trace of caution beneath her calm. I folded my hands lightly on the table, my movements unhurried, my expression steady, and I spoke with the same quiet clarity that had guided me from the moment I chose not to follow the path they had prepared. I have already transferred certain responsibilities into a structure that cannot be changed without my direct approval, I said, and I did not need to explain further, because the implication was clear, not dramatic, not loud, but absolute. The room held still for a moment, not frozen, but suspended, as if everything that had been expected to happen next had quietly stepped aside to make room for something else entirely. Something they had not planned for, something they could not easily redirect, and as I sat there, calm and composed, I understood that this was the moment where the outcome shifted completely, not through force, not through argument, but through preparation, awareness, and the simple decision to remain in control of my own life. No one spoke immediately after that, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain or hesitant. It was defined, shaped by something that could not be easily undone, and I could see it in the way Emily's posture remained perfectly straight, while her eyes moved just slightly more often than before, recalculating, reassessing, searching for a version of the situation that still worked in her favor, and finding none that fit as neatly as the one she had originally planned. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair, his hands now resting flat against the table as if grounding himself in something real, something he could understand without interpretation. And when he looked at me again, there was no longer that quiet compliance in his expression, but something closer to awareness, something that had finally stepped outside of the narrative he had been given. "So this is already done," he said, his voice quieter now, not challenging, but clarifying, as if he needed to hear it in simple terms. I met his gaze, my expression steady, my tone calm. "Yes," I said, and that single word carried everything it needed to, without explanation, without embellishment. Robert shifted beside me, and for the first time since we had entered the room, he turned fully toward me, his attention no longer divided, his uncertainty replaced by something that looked like understanding, even if it had come later than it should have. Emily exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of her folder, and when she spoke again, her voice was still composed, still controlled, but no longer guiding the room in the way it had before. "We just wanted to make sure everything was organized," she said, and this time, the statement sounded less like a plan and more like a justification that no longer held the same strength. I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging her words without agreeing or disagreeing, because I understood now that I did not need to challenge her directly for the truth to stand on its own. "And it is," I replied simply, my voice even, my posture relaxed, and I could see how that answer settled into the space between us, not confrontational, not defensive, but final in a way that made further persuasion unnecessary. The papers remained on the table, untouched, their purpose unchanged but their power diminished, and I realized that what they had represented just moments ago no longer existed in the same form, because agreement had been replaced by awareness, and expectation had been replaced by reality. I reached forward then, not for the pen, but for my own document, folding it neatly and returning it to my bag with the same calm precision I had maintained throughout, and that simple action seemed to mark the end of something without needing to be announced. Daniel looked down at the papers in front of him, then back at me, and for a moment, he seemed as though he might say more, might ask a question that had been forming in his mind, but instead, he nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging a truth he could not ignore anymore. Robert stood quietly, his chair moving back with a soft sound against the floor, and I followed, not hurried, not delayed, simply continuing forward in a way that felt entirely my own. Emily remained seated for a second longer than the rest of us, her composure intact, her expression carefully neutral, but there was a stillness to her now that had not been there before, as if the structure she had relied on had shifted in a way that required more time to adjust than she had anticipated. I turned toward the door, the light from outside filtering through the glass, steady and clear, and as I stepped forward, I felt no need to look back immediately, no need to confirm what had already been established. The air outside felt the same as it had before, cool and quiet, the same gentle breeze moving through the trees, but something within me had settled into a clarity that I knew would not fade. Robert walked beside me, his pace matching mine without hesitation this time, and though he did not speak, I could sense that he understood more now than he had earlier that day. Daniel followed a few steps behind, his presence quieter, more reflective, as if he were still processing what had unfolded, still stepping out of the version of events he had accepted without question. I paused briefly at the edge of the parking lot, looking out at the road ahead, the same road we had turned away from not long ago, and I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible breath, not of relief, but of recognition, because the most important moment had not been when we sat at that table, or when the documents were placed in front of me, but when I chose a different direction before any of it could begin. I did not need to say it out loud, not to them, not to anyone, because it was already clear in everything that followed, in every step taken outside of what had been arranged. I had seen the path they prepared, and I had chosen not to walk it, and that choice, quiet and simple as it was, had changed everything.